The sterile corridors of the Galactic Council station hummed with an artificial calm that belied the storm brewing within its walls. Ambassador Jonathan Kincaid's quarters, typically a sanctuary of diplomatic discourse, had become a tomb. The ambassador's body lay sprawled across the metallic floor, his expression frozen in a mask of shock that would haunt those who discovered him for years to come. Chief Security Officer Terran, a towering Varel whose reptilian features commanded respect and fear in equal measure, stood at the entrance to the crime scene. His slit-pupilled eyes narrowed as they swept across the room, taking in details that others might miss. The ambassador's death was clean, too clean. No signs of struggle, no apparent trauma, just the haunting stillness of a life suddenly extinguished. "Seal off the area," he barked to his security team, his scaled throat vibrating with the command. "No one enters or leaves without my explicit approval." The team moved with practiced efficiency, establishing a perimeter that would soon become the center of an interstellar incident. Counselor Vector arrived minutes later, his silver-hued exoskeleton catching the harsh station lighting. As a member of the Proker species, his presence carried the weight of both political authority and intellectual superiority. His mandibles clicked thoughtfully as he surveyed the scene, more concerned with its implications than the loss of life it represented. "This is an inconvenience," Vector stated, his compound eyes reflecting the sterile white of the station's emergency lighting. "The humans are already suspicious of our motives. This incident will only fuel their paranoia." Terran straightened, his massive frame towering over even Vector's impressive height. "With respect, Counselor, this isn't merely an incident. It's a death under highly questionable circumstances." "It will remain an incident," Vector replied sharply, his mandibles clicking with finality. "See to it." The following hours saw the Galactic Council convene in emergency session, their private chamber becoming an arena for subtle power plays and barely concealed agendas. Vector stood at the head of the assembly, his presence commanding attention from the diverse gathering of species representatives. "We must maintain stability," he began, his voice carrying the smooth authority that had made him one of the most influential figures in galactic politics. "Ambassador Kincaid's demise, while regrettable, cannot be allowed to disrupt the delicate balance we've achieved here." Counselor Radok, an Urvi whose crystalline skin refracted light in mesmerizing patterns, spoke up. "And how do you propose we explain this to the humans? They will demand answers, and they will not settle for a sanitized version of events." Vector's response was immediate and calculated. "We control the narrative. We frame this as a tragic accident, perhaps a malfunction in his quarter's environmental systems. We have the means to make it convincing." The chamber erupted in murmured discussions, some concerned, others supportive. Radok's crystalline features darkened, his natural luminescence dimming with disapproval. "Deception is a dangerous path, Vector. If we're caught." "We won't be," Vector interrupted, his certainty carrying the weight of experience. "As long as we act decisively, the alternative is chaos." The room fell into uneasy agreement. The stakes were too high to risk open conflict with humanity, a species whose rapid advancement and unpredictable nature had already begun to shift the balance of power in the galaxy. Meanwhile, in the depths of the station, Terran worked methodically to implement the Council's decision. Surveillance logs were altered, showing Kincaid returning to his quarters alone hours before his death. The actual footage, revealing a brief but heated encounter with an unidentified Proker figure, was systematically erased. Forensic teams manipulated environmental data to suggest a failure in the oxygen filtration system, a plausible explanation for the ambassador's death, given the station's complex infrastructure. But as Terran carried out his orders, doubt gnawed at him. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on his consciousness, particularly in quiet moments when he found himself staring at Kincaid's face in the falsified records. The human's eyes seemed to stare back with an unspoken accusation. The news of Kincaid's death reached Earth with the speed of quantum communication but the impact of a supernova. The United Earth government, blindsided by the announcement, immediately demanded an independent investigation. Vector's fabricated reports were transmitted promptly, but the humans weren't satisfied. In a secure conference room on Earth, Commodore Elias Harker slammed his fist against the polished table. "They think we're fools," he growled, his weathered face flushed with anger. "Concade didn't just drop dead. They're hiding something." President Anthony Steele, a seasoned diplomat who had worked closely with Concade, nodded grimly. "Agreed. The Galactic Council's version of events is too convenient. We need someone who can cut through the lies and get to the truth." The room fell silent as the implications settled over the assembled leaders. Then a young aide spoke up hesitantly, "There's one man who might be able to handle this, but he's unconventional." Steele arched an eyebrow. "Damian Watson." The name hung in the air like a promise, or a threat. Back on the station, cracks in the carefully constructed facade began to show. Counselor Radok, his conscience weighing heavily, sought out Terran in the quiet of the station's observation deck. The stars beyond the reinforced viewport shone cold and distant, a reminder of the vastness and loneliness of their position. "This cover-up," Radok began, his voice barely above a whisper, "it will unravel. You know this as well as I." Terran didn't respond immediately, his clawed hands gripping the railing as he stared into the void. "It's not my place to question the Council's decisions." "And yet you question them," Radok pressed. "You're not blind, Terran. You saw what happened. That was no accident." Terran turned to face him, his eyes glinting with frustration. "What do you want me to say, Radok? That I regret what we're doing?" "Fine, I do. But regret doesn't change reality. If I speak out, I'll be silenced. You will be too." Radok's crystalline skin dimmed further, a sign of deep internal conflict. "Perhaps. But there's a line we cannot cross. When humans discover the truth, and they will, the repercussions will be catastrophic." As they spoke, a quantum-speed transport was already en route to the station, carrying Damian Watson, a man whose reputation for uncovering the truth had made him both respected and feared throughout human space. The Galactic Council's carefully constructed house of cards was about to face its greatest test, and the truth about Ambassador Concade's death would shake the foundations of interstellar politics. Little did they know, this was just the beginning of a crisis that would forever change the balance of power in the galaxy. As Watson's transport approached the station, the real question wasn't whether the truth would come out, but who would survive when it did. Damian Watson's first steps onto the Galactic Council station were measured and deliberate. His dark coat, worn from countless investigations across the stars, swept behind him as he moved through the reception area. The station's artificial atmosphere carried the familiar metallic taste of recycled air, but there was something else, an undercurrent of tension that made his finely tuned instincts tingle. "Detective Watson," Terran's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Your reputation precedes you." The Varel security chief towered over him, scales gleaming under the station's harsh lighting. Watson's steel-gray eyes met Terran's reptilian gaze. "Most reputations are exaggerated, Chief Terran. I'm just here to ask questions." "Questions can be dangerous things in diplomatic circles," Terran replied, mandibles twitching slightly. "Especially when they concern matters already settled." "Nothing's settled until it's true," Watson countered, pulling out a small holographic projector. "Shall we begin with Ambassador Concade's quarters?" The walk to the crime scene was filled with weighted silence. Watson observed everything, the positioning of security cameras, the flow of station personnel, the subtle ways other species gave them a wide berth. His mind catalogued each detail, building a mental map of not just the station's physical layout, but its power dynamics. Inside Concade's quarters, Watson moved with practiced efficiency. His augmented vision implants, standard issue for top Earth investigators, scanned surfaces for traces invisible to normal sight. "The environmental system failure report is quite detailed," he remarked casually. "Almost too detailed." Terran shifted uncomfortably. "Our technical teams are thorough." Thorough enough to explain why the backup life support didn't kick in? Watson asked, his finger tracing a barely visible scratch on the wall. Standard protocol for all diplomatic quarters includes triple redundant life support systems. Yet according to your report, all three failed simultaneously. Before Terran could respond, a new presence entered the room. Counselor Vector's silver exoskeleton caught the light as he stepped through the doorway. Detective Watson, I trust you're finding everything in order. Watson straightened, studying the Proctor counselor with undisguised interest. That depends on your definition of order, counselor. I'm finding quite a few things that defy probability. Vector's mandibles clicked in what might have been amusement. The universe often defies probability, detective. That's why we have investigators like yourself to make sense of it. Indeed, Watson replied, pulling out a small device. Speaking of making sense, I'd like to perform a molecular scan of the room. Standard procedure. I'm afraid that won't be possible, Vector said smoothly. Station protocols prohibit unauthorized scanning technology. Watson's smile didn't reach his eyes. Interesting. Ambassador Concade's personal effects included a similar scanner. Part of the standard diplomatic package. Yet it's not listed in the inventory of items found in his quarters. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Vector's compound eyes reflected the artificial light in fractals. Are you implying something, detective? Not at all, counselor. Just noting inconsistencies. They tend to pile up in cases like this. Watson moved to the spot where Concade's body had been found. For instance, the official report states he was found face down, yet the blood pooling patterns suggest he was on his back for at least an hour after death. Terran's scales rippled with tension. You seem to have developed quite a few theories in a short time. Theories are like shadows, Chief Terran. They change shape depending on where you stand. Watson pulled out a small vial. This was found in my preliminary scan of the air filtration system. Trace amounts of a synthetic compound, oddly similar to a nerve agent developed by the Proctor Science Division 3 cycles ago. Vector's composure cracked slightly. That's classified information. Is it? I wouldn't know. I'm just a simple investigator following the evidence. Watson pocketed the vial. Though I find it interesting that you recognize the compound so quickly. The tension in the room was interrupted by an urgent message on Terran's communicator. The security chief's eyes widened slightly as he read it. If you'll excuse me, there's a situation requiring my attention. As Terran left, Watson noticed Vector's subtle hand movement, a signal to someone outside the room. The detective's augmented hearing picked up the soft sound of multiple footsteps approaching. Detective Watson, Vector said, his tone carrying a note of finality, I believe this investigation has reached its natural conclusion. Natural conclusions are rare in my line of work, counselor. Watson's hand casually moved toward his concealed weapon. They're usually manufactured, like environmental system failures. The door slid open, revealing 4 heavily armed security officers. Their weapons, while not drawn, were clearly ready for use. This is a delicate time for interspecies relations, Vector continued. We can't allow one tragic accident to destabilize years of diplomatic progress. Watson's laugh was devoid of humor. Funny thing about progress, counselor. It often requires taking a few steps backward to move forward. His hand moved from his weapon to his coat pocket, where a quantum-encrypted transmitter had been steadily broadcasting everything since he entered the station. Are you threatening the peace of this station? Vector's voice carried a dangerous edge. Peace built on lies isn't peace at all, Watson replied. It's just a prettier word for submission. You know what humans are notoriously bad at, counselor? Submitting. The security officers moved closer, their weapons now drawn. Watson remained perfectly still, his mind racing through scenarios and escape routes. But before the situation could escalate further, alarms began blaring throughout the station. Security breach in Section 7, an automated voice announced. All personnel report to designated safety zones. Vector's compound eyes narrowed. What have you done? Me? I've been here the whole time, Watson said innocently. Though I should mention that I didn't come alone. Earth's response to Ambassador Concade's death isn't limited to one investigator. The station shuddered slightly, and Watson's transmitter buzzed with an encrypted message, package secured. Proceed with extraction. Now, Counselor, Watson said, his calm demeanor unchanged despite the chaos erupting around them, shall we discuss what really happened to Ambassador Concade? Or would you prefer to explain it to the Joint Species Tribunal that's currently assembling in response to the evidence my team has been gathering? The lights flickered, and in that moment of darkness, the power dynamics in the room shifted irreversibly. The truth, like the justice it served, would not be denied. The Galactic Council Station's emergency protocols triggered a cascade of security measures, but they weren't fast enough to prevent what was already in motion. As klaxons wailed through the corridors, Counselor Radok's crystalline form shimmered with agitation as he burst into Vector's private chambers, where a secret meeting was already in progress. They know everything, Radok announced, his usually melodious voice sharp with panic. Watson's team didn't just investigate, they infiltrated our secure archives. Vector's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sign of severe distress his species rarely displayed. Around the room, representatives from 7 of the most powerful species in the galaxy shifted uncomfortably. They were the true power behind the Council, the Shadow Consensus, as they called themselves. Impossible, hissed Sval, the Meridian delegate whose gaseous form swirled with dark purpose. The archives are quantum-locked. No human technology could. They didn't use technology, Radok interrupted. They used our own people. Watson's presence was a distraction. While we focused on him, his team turned our own staff against us. Vector's compound eyes reflected the emergency lights in fractals of red. Who? Everyone we overlooked, Radok replied. The maintenance crews, the lower-level administrators, even some of the diplomatic aides. They've been gathering evidence for months, long before Concade's death. The revelation hit the room like a gravitational wave. Concade's murder hadn't been the beginning, it was merely the catalyst that brought everything to the surface. Meanwhile, in the station's lower levels, Watson moved swiftly through maintenance tunnels, following a path mapped out by months of careful planning. Behind him, the sound of pursuit echoed through the metal corridors. His quantum transmitter buzzed continuously with updates from his team. Package Alpha secured, came the first message. Financial records showing the Shadow Consensus's manipulation of resource allocation across 17 systems. Another buzz, Package Beta confirmed. Genetic engineering programs designed to create biological weapons specific to human physiology. A third, Package Gamma retrieved. Evidence of systematic suppression of human technological advancement through sabotage trade agreements. Watson allowed himself a grim smile. The murder of Ambassador Concade had been a tragedy, but it had also been an opportunity, one that humanity had been waiting for. The ambassador's death had provided the perfect cover for an operation years in the making. In the station's main security hub, Terran watched in growing horror as system after system reported breaches. But these weren't attacks, they were revelations. Encrypted files were being decrypted and broadcast across secure channels throughout the galaxy. The truth was spreading faster than any quarantine could contain it. You knew, he accused Radok, who had just entered the hub. You knew this would happen. The Irby's crystalline surface rippled with something that might have been satisfaction. I suspected. Humans aren't like us, Terran. They don't play the long game of politics and patience. When they strike to win. In his private sanctuary, Vector frantically communicated with his superiors on the Procker homeworld. The humans couldn't have done this alone, he insisted. They had help. Inside help. The response came back immediately, of course they did. Did you really think we were the only ones playing multiple sides? The truth began to dawn on Vector. The Shadow Consensus had thought themselves masters of manipulation, but they had failed to see the bigger picture. While they were busy maintaining their illusion of control, alliances had been forming in the shadows, alliances between those who had grown tired of the old order. On Earth, President Steele watched the operation unfold with calculated satisfaction. Beside him, Commodore Harker coordinated the movements of the human fleet, which had been quietly positioning itself over the past weeks. Vector and his cohort thought they could keep humanity confined to our little corner of the galaxy, Steele mused. They never understood that containment only works if the contained species doesn't realize they're being contained. Harker nodded grimly. Kincaid figured it out, didn't he? That's why they killed him. Yes, Steele confirmed. But they didn't realize he'd already passed on everything he'd discovered. His death wasn't just a murder, it was a signal. The signal we've been waiting for. Back on the station, Watson finally reached his destination, a seemingly ordinary maintenance room that housed one of the station's quantum cores. His team had already secured the area, and Dr. Sarah Chen, Earth's leading expert in xenotechnology, was waiting for him. It's exactly as Kincaid's data suggested, she said, her fingers dancing over the holographic interface. They've been using these cores not just for computation, but for consciousness transfer. The Shadow Consensus isn't just a political body, it's a collective consciousness, preserving the minds of the most powerful members of each species across generations. Watson stared at the pulsing quantum core. That's how they've maintained their control for so long. They're not just working from inherited knowledge, they're the same beings, transferring themselves into new bodies when needed. And using that accumulated knowledge to keep emerging species like humanity in check, Chen added. But they never considered that we might develop our own quantum consciousness technology. They were so convinced of their superiority that they didn't notice when we caught up. The station shuddered again, but this time it wasn't from security protocols. The human fleet had arrived, emerging from quantum space at precisely calculated points around the station. But they weren't alone. Ships from a dozen other species, those who had secretly allied with humanity, appeared alongside them. In the council chambers, chaos erupted as the truth became impossible to contain. The Shadow Consensus's centuries-long manipulation of galactic civilization was exposed, laid bare for all species to see. The carefully maintained hierarchy was crumbling, and in its place, a new order was already taking shape. Vector, watching his life's work disintegrate, finally understood the magnitude of his failure. The humans hadn't just solved a murder, they had orchestrated the greatest political revolution in galactic history. And they had done it not through superior technology or military might, but through something the Shadow Consensus had never truly understood, the power of shared grievance and the strength of genuine alliance. The next 48 hours on the Galactic Council station witnessed a transformation unprecedented in the history of interstellar politics. The quantum cores, once the secret source of the Shadow Consensus's power, now broadcast their own betrayal across every communication channel in known space. Species that had been manipulated for centuries watched in stunned silence as the truth of their suppression was laid bare. In the station's primary conference chamber, now secured by human and allied forces, President Steele addressed the emergency assembly of species representatives. His holographic presence, transmitted from Earth, carried both authority and restraint. "We are not here to destroy the Council," Steele declared, his voice resonating through the chamber. "We are here to reform it. The age of shadow manipulation and synthetic suppression ends today." The assembled delegates, many still reeling from the revelations, watched as holographic displays showed the extent of the Shadow Consensus's manipulation. Trade routes deliberately designed to stifle technological growth, genetic research twisted to create hidden vulnerabilities, and cultural exchanges engineered to foster dependency, all of it now exposed. Vector, stripped of his authority but required to attend, watched with mounting dread as his carefully constructed world crumbled. "You have no idea what you're unleashing," he warned, his mandibles clicking in agitation. The stability of thousands of worlds was built on lies, Commodore Harker interrupted, stepping forward. The veteran commander's presence was a reminder of humanity's newfound military readiness. Stability through suppression isn't stability at all. It's just delayed chaos. In the station's lower levels, Dr. Chen and her team worked frantically to secure the quantum cores. The technology they contained wasn't just politically sensitive, it was revolutionary. The ability to transfer consciousness had implications that could reshape civilization itself. They used this to maintain power across generations, Chen explained to Watson as they examined the core's complex architecture. But they never imagined it could be used to preserve and share knowledge across all species, not just their elite. Watson nodded, his investigator's mind already seeing the bigger picture. They built their own prison, thinking it was a fortress. Every secret they stored, every memory they preserved, it's all evidence now. Above the station, the combined fleet of human and allied ships maintained their defensive position. But they weren't just there to intimidate. Each vessel carried representatives from worlds that had suffered under the Shadow Consensus's manipulation. They were there to ensure that the transition of power wouldn't simply replace one tyranny with another. On the station's observation deck, Terran and Radok watched the assembled fleet, their former animosity forgotten in the face of unprecedented change. "I never thought I'd see this," Radok admitted, his crystalline form reflecting the starlight. "My people have served the consensus for generations, thinking we were preserving peace." "We all did," Terran replied, his scaled features set in grim determination. "That's what makes it so effective. They made us complicit in our own suppression." The station's quantum communication network, now under human control, hummed with activity as thousands of worlds processed the revelations. But it wasn't just shock and anger that spread across the galaxy, it was hope. Species that had been relegated to the margins of galactic society suddenly saw a path forward. In a secure chamber deep within the station, Watson interrogated one of the captured Shadow Consensus members, a being so ancient its original species was barely recognizable. "You think you've won," the creature said, its voice carrying the weight of centuries. "But you've only succeeded in destroying the framework that prevented chaos." Watson leaned forward, his eyes reflecting the same steel that had driven humanity to this moment. "No, we've succeeded in exposing the framework that prevented progress. There's a difference." Throughout the station, teams of human and allied scientists worked to understand and preserve the vast repository of knowledge stored in the quantum cores. But they didn't just study it, they shared it. Information that had been hoarded for generations began flowing freely between species. President Steele's hologram addressed the assembly again, this time with a proposal that would reshape galactic society. "We're establishing the Galactic Knowledge Commons," he announced. "All technological and scientific discoveries, all cultural and historical records, freely available to all species. No more artificial barriers, no more engineered dependencies." The reaction was immediate and varied. Some delegates protested, claiming such openness would lead to chaos. Others saw the potential for unprecedented advancement. But all recognized that the old order was gone forever. In the station's medical bay, Dr. Chen made another stunning discovery. The consciousness transfer technology, she explained to Watson and Steele's hologram. It wasn't just for preserving their leaders. They were using it to edit and control the collective memory of entire species. Memory manipulation on a galactic scale, Watson mused. No wonder they were so confident in their control. They weren't just ruling through power, they were rewriting history itself. But even as humanity and its allies worked to dismantle the old system, new challenges emerged. Several worlds, deeply invested in the old order, began mobilizing their fleets. The Shadow Consensus had contingency plans centuries in the making, and they were beginning to activate. Commodore Harker's voice crackled over the command channel, multiple quantum space ruptures detected. Ships emerging, configurations unknown. President Steele's hologram flickered as he processed the information. They're calling in their hidden forces, he realized. The ones they kept off every official record. Let them come, Watson said, his hand resting on the quantum core interface. We have something they never expected to face, the truth, and enough species willing to fight for it. As the station's sensors registered more ships emerging from quantum space, humanity and its allies prepared for the next phase of their revolution. The murder of Ambassador Concade had sparked more than just an investigation, it had ignited a flame of change that would either forge a new galactic order or consume the old one in its fire. The Galactic Council station shook as the first wave of quantum space ruptures heralded the arrival of the Shadow Consensus's hidden fleet. These weren't ordinary warships, they were relics of ancient conflicts, preserved and enhanced over centuries, each vessel a testament to technologies that had been deliberately suppressed from the wider galaxy. In the station's command center, Commodore Harker's hologram materialized beside Watson and Dr. Chen. 97 vessels of unknown configuration, he reported grimly. Energy signatures unlike anything in our database. That's because they're not from our time, Chen replied, her fingers dancing across the quantum core interface. These ships, they're from civilizations that were deliberately destroyed. The consensus didn't just suppress technology, they absorbed it, kept it for themselves. Watson's expression hardened as he watched the tactical display. Then it's time we used their own history against them. Throughout the station, the quantum cores hummed with unprecedented activity. Dr. Chen's team had worked frantically to repurpose the consciousness transfer technology, but not for preservation, for revelation. Every secret, every suppressed memory, every hidden truth stored in the cores was about to be broadcast across the galaxy. President Steele's hologram addressed the assembled fleet commanders. All Allied vessels, maintain defensive positions. We're not here to fight their war, we're here to end it. In the void of space, the Shadow Consensus fleet moved with unnatural precision, their formation speaking of tactics developed over millennia. But they faced something they had never encountered before, unity. The combined fleet of humans and allied species didn't just represent military might, it represented a galaxy awakening to its own potential. Deep within the station, Vector had broken free during the chaos, making his way to a hidden command center. His mandibles clicked rapidly as he initiated emergency protocols that had laid dormant for centuries. You don't understand, he broadcast across all frequencies. We are the guardians of order. Without us, the galaxy will tear itself apart. No, Watson's voice replied calmly. We understand perfectly. You're not guardians, you're parasites. And your time is over. At that moment, Dr. Chen activated the modified quantum cores. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Every ship in the Shadow Consensus fleet received a massive data burst, not of tactical information, but of truth. The suppressed memories of countless civilizations, the real histories of destroyed worlds, the faces of trillions who had suffered under their rule. The impact on the ancient consciousness networks that controlled their ships was catastrophic. Vessels began breaking formation as their crews, many of them artificial constructs maintained by the consensus, were overwhelmed by the weight of their own hidden history. In the secure chamber where the captured consensus member was held, the ancient being began to laugh, a sound that turned to screaming as centuries of suppressed memories flooded back. You don't know what you've done, it gasped. The barriers between past and present, they're breaking down. Good, Watson replied. It's time for the past to have its say. Above the station, the battle had become something else entirely. The Shadow Consensus fleet, their carefully maintained control shattered by the flood of restored memories, began to turn on itself. Ships crewed by the consciousness of ancient rivals remembered their old hatreds. Others, commanded by the victims of the consensus's manipulations, simply powered down, their artificial crews refusing to continue fighting. President Steele's voice carried across all channels, to all ships and worlds receiving this transmission, what you're experiencing is not an attack. It's remembrance. The Shadow Consensus didn't just control the present, they rewrote the past. Today, we restore what was taken. In the station's observation deck, Terran and Radok watched as the mighty fleet that had emerged to crush the rebellion began to dissolve. All this time, Radok whispered, his crystalline form pulsing with emotion, "We thought we were preserving civilization. But we were just helping them imprison it." "Not anymore," Terran replied, his scaled features set with determination. "Look." Throughout the galaxy, the quantum network that had once served as the consensus's tool of control now carried a different message. Species that had been deliberately kept apart discovered shared histories. Worlds that had been told they were ancient enemies found evidence of past alliances. The carefully maintained walls between civilizations began to crumble. In the hidden command center, Vector made one last attempt to restore control. But as he reached for the quantum interface, he found himself facing not just Watson, but the holographic projections of every species representative whose memories he had helped suppress. "Ambassador Concade discovered what you really were," Watson said quietly. "That's why you killed him. But you forgot something crucial about humans: we learn from our dead. His murder wasn't your victory. It was your mistake." The station's quantum cores pulsed one final time, and Vector's ancient consciousness, preserved through countless transfers, finally confronted the full weight of its actions. His silver exoskeleton crumpled as centuries of carefully maintained control shattered. In the aftermath, as the Allied fleet secured the station and began the process of establishing a new galactic order, Watson stood in Ambassador Concade's quarters one last time. The room was different now, not a crime scene, but a memorial to the moment when everything changed. President Steele's hologram appeared beside him. "The Shadow Consensus is finished. Their hidden fleets are standing down across the galaxy. But this is just the beginning." Watson nodded. "They spent centuries making sure we were all afraid of each other. It's going to take time to undo that damage. But now we have time," Steele replied. "And something more important, truth." As the station's artificial day cycle began anew, ships from across the galaxy continued to arrive, not for war, but for reconciliation. The quantum cores, repurposed under Dr. Chen's guidance, became the foundation of a new network dedicated to sharing knowledge rather than suppressing it. In the station's Great Assembly Hall, representatives from hundreds of species gathered to sign the Galactic Concordat, a new agreement based on genuine cooperation rather than manufactured stability. The first article, proposed by humanity and unanimously accepted, was simple: the past belongs to all. The future will be written together. Ambassador Concade's death had indeed changed everything, not because of how he died, but because of what his death revealed. In trying to silence one voice, the Shadow Consensus had awakened billions. The galaxy would never be the same. And in the quantum cores that had once held the secrets of their oppression, a new kind of consciousness began to emerge, one built not on control and suppression, but on the shared memories and hopes of a galaxy finally free to remember its own history and write its own future. The end.